The fans are the ones who've lost out through Joseph Parker and Joyce not fighting. And that's a fact. And while we now have an offer from boxer promoter Ben Shalom for Joyce to go over to Sky Sports to fight their new signing Joseph Parker, the fight is dead. Joseph Parker ensured that when his promotional rights were signed over to Boxer and Sky. But how did we get here? Who's to blame, and how much blame do we apportion to the players involved? And as with any story, especially an unhappy ending story, there's two sides, two versions of events, and in this case, no innocent parties. What I want to do is set the table with how this prospective fight came on the radar. I'll step through a few points and then play some clips from both sides and weigh in with some thoughts along the way. So let's rewind to April 2022. We had both fighters in attendance for Tyson Fury-Dillian Whyte, with Frank Warren in between one of the fights announcing that they were looking to hold Joyce vs Joseph Parker in July 2022. BT Sport even put out a mock promo poster foreshadowing an eventual fight. Problem being, both fighters in that same segment where Warren announced the fight, both confirmed that it wasn't quite a done deal. At the time, I said announcing a fight when a contract had not been finalised was a risky proposition for Warren, and it could certainly help Parker's negotiating position. Frank Warren, after all, had time-boxed himself into a July fight date. Then in late May, Frank Warren comes out publicly saying, "We were all set for July, but Parker can't fight because Andy Lee's wife is due to have a baby." He then went on to say that September could be when the fight would take place, but Joyce, who was coming back from a broken wrist, would have a fight in the interim in July. Nothing then happens for almost 3 weeks, with it announced on 12 June, and that's in New Zealand, might have been the 11th in the Northern Hemisphere. Parker announces on social media that he'd signed with Boxer and Sky. Parker has subsequently called for the fight again, with Ben Shalom of Boxer floating an offer out in public of £1.2 million for Joyce to come over to Sky to fight Parker on their pay-per-view platform. Obviously, on the other side, you have a very unhappy Frank Warren, who we'll start with first. Talking to TalkSport, the first clip, he is recounting Parker and Joyce meeting face to face in April.
Him and Joe got together, and we announced it that it was to be done, and Joe, and we agreed terms. I shook hands with Joe in front of Tyson, and then we got the solicitors to work out and get the contracts, which took a long while, but eventually they got them done.
I guess I have a couple of problems with what Frank Warren is saying there, because Parker publicly said, and that was in the clip we played earlier, that the fight wasn't signed, that they were close but it wasn't a done deal. And Joyce also backed that up, remember. But one question being, why did Frank Warren feel compelled that he had to announce a fight that wasn't official at Fury Whyte? He made a rod for his own back by doing that, increasing expectations. And as part of that, all I saw from fans after that point, when they said this could go ahead in July, and also from YouTubers as well, that it was basically a done deal. People said it was happening when it wasn't. And the fact that things went silent for a prolonged period after Fury Whyte, it was almost certainly an indication a deal wasn't in place. Otherwise, they would have announced it. Fighters would have been in camp. There would have been some promotional work, and all of this would have been set for July. But obviously, none of that happened. Frank Warren also had spun a line in public about July not working initially due to Parker's trainer Andy Lee, his wife, being due to have a baby. Which I would note, and I did a search for this, I haven't seen Parker or Lee comment on that in public. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but it's been accepted as fact at this point. But I think the real situation, the reality of the situation, there was a stalemate on the negotiating front. Clearly there was. And I think that baby story was being used as a smokescreen. And the negotiating stalemate was always a possibility when negotiating a fight with Parker and his manager David Higgins, who have been notoriously hard to negotiate with, and openly saying they'll chase the biggest money around. Okay, so the next couple of clips will play back to back.
You know, even if he was offered a better deal, having agreed terms, You know, somebody said to me, right, you know, we've agreed, you know, I'm paying you 100 quid. You know, I'd say, look, somebody's offered me 110 quid. Do you want to better it? At least do that. Nothing at all. He never wanted that fight. He never fancied it. And that's the bottom line. But you know what? Joe Joyce is the guy who's the mandatory in rank number one, not Parker. So we had, and remember when we made this fight, and they sodded us around for a while. And I'm very disappointed in Joe because, you know, he got well looked after. He was the standby opponent, by the way, for Tyson when everybody was concerned whether
Dillian was going to turn up.
Dillian was going to pull out, and he got paid. He got paid a large amount of money. So he's not behaved honourably at all. Not honourably at all. You know, handshake means nothing. Word means nothing, and you know they just messed us all around.
So there is a few things to unpack there, but Frank Warren says terms were agreed and a handshake done. Given Parker's earlier comments about a deal not being done, make of that what you will. But he does raise a good point about Parker and team coming back and saying, will you match this offer that we've had from Sky? Frank Warren is saying this just never happened. And remembering, with Parker being a promotional free agent, there were no barriers to the fight being made from a promotional standpoint. If he wanted the fight when he was a free agent, all he had to do was sort out the contract and the fight was there. So Parker turning around and signing elsewhere, it does raise the question about how much he did want the fight, because the path of least resistance to get the fight was signing with Queensberry, if he really wanted the fight. But I guess the devil is in the detail. What was the overall deal, the overall commitment? Was it 2 or 3 fights with Frank Warren? All those sorts of things come into it. Likely it wasn't just one fight. And just on the other point about Parker being a standby opponent in April for Tyson Fury if Dillian Whyte pulled out, and that he was paid well for that, does that really have any relevance to the Joyce fight? I don't think so. So what is the point in Frank Warren raising it? Maybe Warren thought that that was going to be some sort of sweetener to help Parker get into the tent, help sign him, but clearly Joseph Parker took that money and he ran. Frank Warren does have a right to feel aggrieved because he thought the fight was going to get done, thought it was going to get made, and that his man, Joe Joyce, was going to have the biggest opponent of his career to date, but it didn't happen. Parker did snake Frank Warren there, and clearly Team Parker was negotiating elsewhere at the same time that a deal was being hashed out with Warren. But according to Parker, Warren needs to shoulder some of the blame for a deal not getting done.
Frank can say whatever he wants to say. He kept changing the deal. The contract kept changing, and that's why it took so long to lock in. We were so close to locking in, but every time he came back, it was different. There was something always different in it. And then, you know, I said to him that I could make the fight happen. He shook my hand on one deal, and all of a sudden went back and changed the deal. So, listen, we can go back and forth and say this and say that, but why don't we just make the fight happen?
Parker makes a good point. If Frank Warren kept changing the details of the deal, he's got to take some blame. It's pretty simple, really. And if the deal was changing, you have to ask, well, what was changing and why? But moving on to 3 other clips of Parker insisting that he still wants the Joyce fight.
At the end of September, early October, and we still want to get the fight with Joyce. Listen, I know they said because I signed with a different platform we can't make it happen, but listen, just when egos come into play, Frank Warren doesn't have an ego. I'm sure he can let, you know, Joe Joyce come into the Sky platform and fight me. There's number 1 and number 2 fight each other, so why not? Why not make it happen? Just because he's on BBC Sports and I'm on Sky doesn't mean we can't make it happen. It's all egos, I think. Our team, I think, Rom and Adam are in talks with Frank at the moment to try and make it happen. So hopefully we can lock something in soon.
Okay, so I've got some problems with these statements. Parker is really pandering to the uninformed here. He's trying to make out that it's realistic for a fight to get done, and it's now about egos rather than promotional barriers. He is being disingenuous. Parker knows full well that Frank Warren promotes Joe Joyce, and he has an obligation to deliver fights to his broadcaster, BT, just as Ben Shalom does with Sky for Parker. It's not about egos. It never was. It's about money, and it always is and was, especially in this case. Parker signed a deal with Sky and Boxer because it was a better deal, which means more money. If it's not about ego, as Parker says, well, why doesn't Parker ask if he can be loaned out to Warren and BT? Not going to happen, is it? And that's why this whole ego argument from Parker is nonsense, and he's trying to pull one over on the fans with this rhetoric. The reality is, Parker doesn't care who he fights. He cares about getting paid, and signing with Sky and Boxer was always the death of the Joyce fight. An offer for Joyce to fight on Sky is window dressing. It's a face-saving exercise for PR purposes. He doesn't want to be accused of ducking Joyce, although that narrative has been taking hold. If Parker wanted the Joyce fight, he and his team, well, they could have stayed a free agent, could have kept persisting with ironing out a deal, and taken that fight when whatever negotiating barriers or issues were resolved. But they didn't. But as I say, and as I've covered in this video, different sides of the story, both blaming each other, and there is blame for both sides. No one comes out clean in this one, and ultimately, it was all about money once again. Parker vs Dillian Whyte inbound for late 2022, log it, the money fight that Parker wants.